This is one of my favorite sessions on the agenda. I think it was, as we've already heard this morning, it feels to me that geopolitics is shaping the mining industry today more acutely than at any time in the 15 years that I've followed the sector. Christelle, I wanted to start with you and maybe help us kind of frame what we mean by critical minerals. Is this just a buzzword that's been dreamed up by journalists and PR teams to try and get people interested in mining, or has there been a real shift in attitudes to mineral security, and how's that impacting Eramet?
It's a lot of questions. In fact, there has been a lot of confusion between, I think, critical raw materials, strategic raw materials, rare earths, and people, I think, are mixing all this. I think what we call critical raw materials, they are critical for some industries, and for example, for the energy transition. They are minerals or materials that are absolutely critical to build the value chain. We could say, is it critical in terms of availability, or is it critical in terms of our ability to get them? I don't think, if we take, for example, the metals we are operating in which we are at Eramet, so we operate in manganese, in nickel, in lithium. We don't think that there will be any shortage of these metals for the energy transition. But what is critical is that they are concentrated in some specific area in the world. And they are sometimes in the hands of a limited number of players or a limited number of countries. And especially if you talk about nickel, for example, there is quite a lot of nickel. There is no risk of real shortage of nickel. But the main source of nickel today is in Indonesia. It represents 50% of the mining production of nickel today. It has grown a lot recently. And most of this nickel is processed today by Chinese companies. And 90% of the new projects, HPAL projects, so the transformation of nickel into nickel and cobalt salts for batteries, are Chinese. 90% of the Indonesian projects are Chinese projects. So at the end, they are critical also because they are in some hands that can be friendly to the Western world or not, depending on the situation, depending on the geopolitical context. So I think that is what is making them critical. Now, how do they affect the way we operate? I think there are positive things and a lot of opportunities for companies like us. And there are also many challenges. Some of them have been already mentioned earlier in this session. But the opportunity, of course, is huge growth of demand of this critical raw material, especially for energy transition. So it has been mentioned, multiplying by 2 the demand of nickel, by 3 the one of cobalt, by 6 the one of lithium in the next 10 years. So it's a lot. So it's a huge opportunity for players like Eramet. There is also one big change is that mining, as it was said before, was not on the top of the agenda of the government, especially the Western government. Now it's on the top of the agenda, and we are becoming strategic partners of countries, of government, to develop, for countries who own the resource, for developing their resource, and also strategic partners in terms of sovereignty for our own government. So I think it's positioning the mining industry and us as a company very differently than a few years ago. And also from the investors' point of view, I think the investors are looking at us differently than they used to, because we are also contributing to the energy transition. Now it comes also with many challenges that we have mentioned before. it has increased significantly the nationalism of resources, something that we had already 10 years ago, but that has been enhanced significantly recently. I think there is a statistic of the OECD which says that in the last decade, the export restriction have been for critical raw materials have been multiplied by 5. So there are plenty of now export restrictions. The one that we all know is the ban of Indonesia on nickel ore. Is now and it has been very successful. So now they are doing the same for bauxite, implemented, and they are talking about copper and tin. Recently, some African countries have done the same for Zimbabwe, Mali, Namibia on lithium. There are some, so of course, China with gallium and germanium, now they are putting some restriction, but also Western countries who are limiting the investment of foreign companies in Australia, in US, on critical raw materials. So for us, it obliges us to operate differently, to be able to bring also the downstream step, not only presenting ourselves as miners only. And for example, in Indonesia, when you apply for an exploration permit today, you have to demonstrate that you are able to build the downstream of the value chain that is coming with the mine. So you cannot come just with a mining project, you have to come with a mining plus transformation, plus maybe the next step. So for example, the PCAM production in Indonesia. So it's making our life and our projects very different, and we have to come as a consortium. Doesn't mean that we have to invest ourselves in PCAM, for example, but you have to build partnership consortium with, and we have done, as Eramet, for example, with OEMs, with other companies, for example, also with renewable energy providers, to be able to come with a package to be able to apply for exploration rights, which was absolutely not the case 5 years ago. So it has changed significant things.
Lots of fantastic points there, Christa. We'll come back to a couple of those. Sean, if I can come to you with Syrah, it feels like yours is a company that almost wouldn't exist without this critical minerals kind of debate, or at least wouldn't exist in the same way.
Yeah, absolutely. I think if you look at graphite, 5 years ago, 85% of the graphite market was industrial uses. Today, 80% of the natural graphite market is battery uses. And when you look at the whole supply chain for graphite, something like 65% of mined product comes from China, 85% of the finished anode material that goes into vehicles, but 100% of the precursor spherical graphite is still processed in China today.
100%?
So 100%. And that impact has not been well understood until the build-out of battery manufacturing capacity and electric vehicle manufacturing capacity in Europe and the US started to really manifest this issue of where is this material coming from and what are the alternatives. And the definition of what is a critical mineral is as much about where things are processed and who controls that part of the process as it is where is the material coming from in the upstream. So certainly that definition of what is critical is driven by those things, and it's got the excitement, I think, of governments, OEMs in the auto industry, and certainly the battery manufacturers.
Michael, with you at IGO in Australia, how's the Australian mining sector looking at this question of critical minerals and the Australian government as well?
I think very carefully is the answer, because Australia has always been a great welcomer of investment coming from outside, and for the first time, in the time I've been in the industry anyway, the source of that investment becomes very important. And while Australia is trying to tread a very careful line in this and still wanting to welcome inward investment, and it's not gone down the road, for example, of Canada as being very clear about Chinese investment, for example, not being welcome right at the moment in the sector. Australia is treading a more careful path, but also very keen to understand in the value chain for each of the minerals that that can be defined as critical. We can argue about which ones are which, but where in that value chain it makes sense for Australia to how far down for Australia to go, and that actually then impacts the choices around the sources of capital. So, for example, where is the expertise to Sean's point earlier? Where is the expertise in downstream processing? If you want to attract that into Australia, then you've got to look at where that's coming from, and therefore be prepared to accept investment from that.
Well, on that point about processing, if I could just stay with you for a second, Michael, is there a risk here that geopolitical concerns mean that you start making decisions about where to place downstream activity, not on the basis of kind of economic rationale, but because of geopolitical rationale, and then that ultimately just leads to higher costs? And we're all kind of cognizant of the fact that there are higher costs going into the mining process at the moment because of the need to comply with ESG standards and things like that.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a very important point. I mean, if you step back from the whole thing, what is happening around the world today is protectionism in a number of different forms. And what that means is, in a lot of ways, is developed countries have the financial capacity to give subsidies and incentives, and that less developed countries don't have that financial capacity, so they tend to have export bans and wanting to enforce downstream processing into the country. And so overall, the impact of that is, for us working in the industry, in the past you really sought to deploy capital in the most efficient location that made sense, without reference necessarily to the geopolitical impact of that. So where does it make sense from a capital and operating cost point of view to build each part of the chain? We can't do that anymore. Yeah. And so, yes, I think it's definitely going to have an impact. And what I think you're going to see is, a sort of striation of pricing where, in the long run, an American consumer buying an EV in the US will probably be paying more, and is already paying more, and will probably continue to pay more than a Chinese consumer buying an EV in China. And that's an inevitable fact about if you have if you can't deploy capital in the most efficient location, prices have to be higher than they would than if you were able to deploy capital in that location. Now, there is another overlay on that, which, again, stepping back from the whole purpose of what we're trying to do, is reduce carbon emissions. And so the carbon footprint of where we're working and how we're working, and the efficiency of, for example, shipping. So shipping waste around the world, where you ship a less refined product and end up shipping dirt across the world, the carbon footprint of that is going to be calculated into the whole thing. And eventually there'll be an effective price of carbon, and there is to some extent today, even if we don't have an actual price of carbon, but that will be priced in as well. So that'll be a counterbalance to that efficiency of deployment of capital from it.
Let's talk about China, and specifically, I'm interested as to how, as mining companies, you kind of view China at the moment. Is it as a partner, is it as a market for your materials, or is it as a competitor or even an enemy? And maybe the starting point. I mean, we had State Department on the stage earlier. He was diplomatic, but earlier this week we had Jennifer Granholm, U.S. Energy Secretary, saying, in a critical minerals context, we're up against a dominant supplier that is willing to weaponize market power for political gain. I mean, a number of you have Chinese partners. So, Ivanhoe. Yep. CITIC, a 25% shareholder at Kamoa-Kakula. You're working with Zijin, and then at the same time you've got U.S. government saying things like that. So, I mean, do you feel like you're kind of caught in the middle between China and the West, and a kind of increasingly kind of active U.S. foreign policy, or is this a position of strength you have because you can kind of see both sides?
I mean, to an extent, we don't mind being caught in the middle, but maybe just to say a word. In the defense of China, the Chinese have been fantastic partners to us at Ivanhoe Mines. I think there is no way that without our partners Zijin and CITIC, we could have built one of the world's biggest copper mines in the space of 3 or 4 short years in the DRC. And that's access to the Chinese supply chain, access to the Chinese skill set. But moreover, I think, and going back to Mike's point about capital allocation, I think the Chinese have been the most efficient allocators of capital to the mining sector for 10 to 20 years. And I think that's what we're trying to, or what governments are trying to change now with this new sort of tag of critical minerals. But that is the most fundamental thing for us as a company, where our business hasn't changed because of the tag of critical minerals. We were an exploration and development business 10 years ago. We still are an exploration and development business. We're looking for world-class assets in almost whatever commodity. And it's nice nowadays that copper is tagged as a critical mineral, because it opens up a different conversation in terms of our ability to access capital, whether that's capital coming directly from governments, and I think we're seeing green shoots in that regard, or whether that's capital coming from the typical investor base, now that there is a realization that critical minerals are a part of the energy transition story, and also from an ESG investor base, where they realize that mining companies are not, they're no longer just a problem. They can be part of the solution, but it has to be done correctly.
Krista, if I can come back to you. I mean, one thing I keep hearing from the US government is it's not necessarily about decoupling from China, but they want to build, if possible, they want to diversify the supply chain so that they can be separate supply chains. I mean, is that possible in some of these metals, to actually have a kind of a supply chain which doesn't include China? You've got a big Chinese partner in Indonesia.
Yeah, so just first to answer your question, again, it depends on the metal. So you have, in some cases, it's spread between different countries, and you can diversify. And it's the same, by the way, in Europe with the Critical Raw Material Act. They put something to say that they don't want to have, at any step of the value chain of the energy transition, a dominance of more than 65% from one single country. If it's possible, because when you have some examples where it's very concentrated in a very limited number of countries, especially if you talk about resources and reserves that are economically viable. Because you take lithium, you can find lithium almost everywhere on the earth. The question is it economically viable to develop those kind of lithium? And if you look at China, for example, they have very poor quality of lithium. So when the price of lithium was at $70,000 per ton, of course, any project could be viable. And China, by the way, was extracting some lithium in their country, but they have invested massively in Australia, in Latin America, in Chile, in Argentina, in order to get the lithium in the areas that you need. So yes, it's good to try to diversify, but sometimes it's not possible, and you have to do with the countries that in fact own the resource. And I would like just to build on what has just been said on Chinese companies. We are blaming China right now, but they had a long-term view that we didn't have 15 or 20 years ago. They understood that for the energy transition, the availability of the critical metals was absolutely key, and that they didn't have them on their territory, and they invested massively to develop mines outside of their territory, in Africa, in Latin America. We estimate that in the last decade they have put about $200 billion just on mining in critical metals outside of their country. So they put a lot of money abroad, and they took the country risk. And at that time, I mean, you had the Western countries saying, oh, no, here it's dirty, here we have issues with the human rights, here we have... Yes, but in Africa, for example, many of these countries are very young democracy. They are not perfect at all. By the way, it took us more than 100 years to move from to build perfect democracy, quote unquote. They are learning, and now we come. The Chinese, they helped developing the value chain in those countries, developing their resource. They helped them when the Western world was not helping. Now the Western world has waken up and try now to go in those countries, but we are late. And in some areas, it will be very difficult to catch up. So back to your point about partnership, we have at some stage to build partnership, including with Chinese companies, because they are there, because they have invested there. And I think it's better to be in partnership with Western companies and get the best of both. And especially they are very keen learning from our ESG practice. And it's what we are experiencing with our partner in Indonesia, a Chinese partner. They are very keen on getting the right ESG standards that they don't have, and because they understand that the market will require it anyway, is requiring it today, and will even more in the future. So I think having the right partnership, not being naive, that in case of conflict, we may have some issues, but at some stage, I think it's better to be in partnership with them than not having access to those resources.
Does anybody disagree with that view that it is necessary to maintain constructive partnerships with Chinese mining companies and consumers?
I think in our case, China is our largest customer from our mine in Mozambique. They're our largest competitor in our downstream anode material facility that we're building in the US. And I guess what I would say about it is that you have to have a degree of pragmatism and be very clear in trying to understand the motivations of each part of that value chain and where China's participating in it. And I think that in the exposure that we've had over the last 7 years or so, it's been very clear that China wants to, and the commercial players in China want to continue to exert a very, very strong influence on the anode side of the battery supply chain. Sure, it's the same on the cathode, and it's certainly the same in battery manufacturing capacity. But ultimately, the transition cannot occur without China providing a significant proportion of that volume. And a lot of what's being done in critical minerals is a rebalancing, and it is a diversification of risk for both the OEMs and in the case of EVs and governments. So the most important thing about it is to ensure that you don't approach it with naivety. You have to be really clear about understanding the boundaries of where China is participating and where you as a player in that chain can participate as well.
Michael, on that point of ensuring that we're not being naive, when we talk about critical minerals, do you think the conversation is focused on the right places? So when we talk about cobalt and lithium and nickel, which are often the kind of three that roll off the tongue, is that where the weaknesses are in kind of Western supply chains in particular? Or are we missing anything?
Look, I think that's an interesting debate and one, and you could take each metal and argue a case either way, perhaps with the exception of copper for because it's just in terms of the demand scenario, substitution is much harder. But look at lithium. In the long term, lithium's a mineral that's quite prevalent in the Earth's crust, and therefore over time there will be discoveries of better quality lithium deposits in a lot of different places, and that production will come into balance. But in the next 10 to 15 years, if you're looking at battery chemistries, particularly in relation to mobility solutions, lithium's just there. So it's very hard to see substitution of any real volumes in the next 10 to 15 years, and the supply side of it is really challenging compared to the demand, and mainly because not so much the scarcity of the mineral, but of the timeframes for development of new projects. And so to argue that lithium's not critical, I think, is a little bit hard in the short to medium term. Nickel, I think, is a question we were debating before the session, where it's going to come to the quality of the mobility solution. A cheaper, shorter range EV can quite happily do without nickel in the battery chemistries. But if you want the highest quality and highest range and highest energy density per kilogram, it still involves nickel at the moment. So is there going to be a splitting up of the demand side for nickel? Is it critical today? Possibly yes, due to the availability question that was raised earlier.
If I come to you, Alex, I've already said a couple of times on this stage that there's this new level of engagement from Western governments with mining companies, and I heard Jose Fernandez talking about that. Beyond the language and the kind of headlines, are they doing the right things? If the Western governments want to diversify and improve the security of supply chains of these minerals, from your perspective as a mining company, are they taking the right action, or are there things that you think they should be doing, which would, for example, support Ivanhoe in your, whether that be in Congo or in an exploration project elsewhere?
Yeah, look, I think we're beginning to see them doing the right things, but it's starting from a very low base. From the perspective of where we are coming from operating in sub-Saharan Africa. So, take, for example, the US government. I'm afraid I missed Jose Fernandez speak earlier, but the US government's investing in the Lobito corridor, which is a 1,600-kilometer rail corridor that connects the Congolese copper belt, where we operate, to its most direct seaport, which is Lobito in Angola. That project has been sitting there for 20 or 30 years waiting for funding and political wherewithal to move it forwards. And while it's great to see the US government investing in that, $250 million is kind of a drop in the ocean compared to what is required in the greater scheme of things. And we're sort of asking the question, where were you all of these years? So for us, it's I keep going back to this point that it's about access to capital to go out there and drill and discover and develop deposits. And I think they're still a long way behind from that point of view. And I also think there is a lot more to be done in terms of the US and other multinationals using the powers that they have to basically help us in terms of the problems that we have operating in places like the DRC. Helping the DRC to operate more transparently, for example, from a tax collection point of view, those kind of things. We could certainly use a hand from the US and others.
We've got about 7 minutes left, so let's see if there's any questions in the room before I come back to you. If anybody has a question, just raise their hand and we'll get a mic to you. We're good for the moment. Let me just see what we have.
Maybe just something
Go ahead,
to
Christelle, yeah.
add, because we talked a lot about the US and IRA, and I think they are quite efficient, trying to catch up. In Europe, also, Europe has, waken up and with this Critical Raw Material Act, etc. And there are quite a lot of subsidies going into the energy transition value chain, but not to the up to the upstream. They put a lot of money, and you have a lot of subsidies, financing tools, etc., available to invest in Europe. You have wherever you want. If you want to build a gigafactory, honestly, today, it took some time, but today you have the subsidies that you require in order to build a battery factory in Europe, or even, the refining or the PCAM part. Investing in mining abroad, outside of Europe, there is no tool for that. And no subsidies, no financing tool. Even if they talk about it, then you go to the institution, the financial institution in Europe, and they say, oh my God, investing in Argentina, it's complex, etc. So, but at the end, it's where the resources are. And we are not even talking about DRC. So today we still have a huge gap. And there is a lot of tools, even starting with the refining, bringing back all the processing in our Western countries, but investing in mining projects abroad, especially in countries that are seen as risky in terms of geopolitics, but sometimes it's where the resources are. It's still something that is missing in the toolbox of the Western countries.
Thinking about the kind of geopolitical chessboard, one region we haven't talked about is the Middle East and the Gulf, and that's one area that the belief is can be a source of capital for upstream mining investment. Obviously, we've seen the Saudi Vale base metals deal. I wanted to put this to the whole kind of panel. Have you had any discussions with financiers from the Gulf? How do you see Saudi Arabia and the GCC kind of fitting into the kind of mining puzzle?
I think it's a really interesting development. I think some of the strategy, and once they get, there's such a weight of capital behind the decisions that can be made. Once they get started, this can generate some real momentum. And the intention in Saudi, for example, to build a full battery value chain, it's quite conceivable that will happen over time. So I think we've certainly been thinking very hard about it, and we can't go into discussions that hadn't been had, but you can see clearly that Chinese people participating in the value chain and batteries in China are there and are very much actively participating in working out how to play with this potential for sourcing Middle East capital. If there's something going to be built there, well, I think we should all be trying to assist in that process.
And Sean, maybe we could just come back to you about your project specifically. I mean, you've actually benefited from this geopolitical shift by getting direct funding from Department of Energy. I mean, I'm interested in kind of how easy was that, and presumably if that hadn't happened, you wouldn't be building a downstream facility in the US.
No, we would have been. We were already building it. So we were the first minerals processing company to get funding through the Advanced Technology Vehicle Manufacturing Program, which is a program that's existed in the DOE for a long, long time, but it was always focused on the auto manufacturers themselves. And under the auspices of the IRA, it started to move upstream, and we were successful in getting around $100 million funding for the first integrated anode material facility in the US. The challenge of getting that in place, and we're also dealing with the Development Finance Corporation for Balama in Mozambique. The level of due diligence, as it should be, is extremely, extremely deep. And when you think about the pace at which China is deploying capital and has deployed capital over the last 2 decades, and the frameworks against which due diligence and industry participants are being measured, there is a fundamental difference between where that capital is coming from and the frameworks against which people are being judged. So we've been incredibly grateful and working very closely with the DOE and the DFC, and it's certainly helping us in terms of potential future expansion as well. But it's a difficult and long process, as it should be in some respects.
Final question. Earlier this year, I think, Christophe, you mentioned it, Chinese government restricted exports of germanium and gallium. If the Chinese government was going to do the same thing and restrict exports of another metal, either raw or kind of processed, in the next year, what would it be? If they wanted to flex their kind of political muscles, as kind of Jennifer Granholm indicated, what would you be most kind of worried about in terms of what would they target? Anyone brave enough to ask?
Look, for me, I mean, I would obviously look at metals where China has an absolute dominance in refining, where China is a massive net exporter, and metals that have a likely military application.
Yeah.
So they would be the 3 categories I would look at, and that would point more towards things like rare earth elements than to copper, let's say.
I don't think that for the metals we have discussed today, I mean nickel, cobalt, lithium, those kind of manganese, they are investing themselves in Europe, for example. They are building, Chinese companies are building battery factories. They are building CAM and PCAM factories. So they will need to feed those factories also. They are integrated in the value chain. They want to sell EVs also to those countries. So at the end, I'm not sure they will fight with those kinds of metals against the Western world. But the one in the military area, yeah, maybe.
Fantastic. Excellent. Look, I think that's all we have time for this morning. So a round of applause for the excellent panelists. Thanks for the discussion.